Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gottfried Hagen. I'm the interim director of the Center for Armenian Studies, and I have the pleasure to welcome you all to this conference on the quotidian and the divine. I have a broad view at monasticism and church life in the Middle East. The Center for Armenian Studies is a largely donation-funded program, and so before I turn the stage over to the actual academic procedures, I want to thank all our supporters out there who have made this program possible over the decades. I hope we also will continue in this way. With this event, the academic programming for the academic year 22-23 is winding down, but we are looking forward to see many of you again next year. And so with this and without further ado, I would like to welcome my colleague, Catherine Babayan, who's one of the organizers for today's lecture and tomorrow's workshop. Thank you, Catherine. We're so much looking forward to this. You get this
from you. Thank you, really, Gottfried, for all of your support and always very wise counsel. I'd also like to thank my co-organizer, Kelly Hanavi, without whom we would not be here because it's her subject that she's working on, Christianity and monasticism, mostly in the Syriac church. And thank you, Viken Muradian, really for making this happen with such good humor and always a smile. So thank you. And I wanted to welcome you all from afar, as far as Munich, and the different corners of the United States, from California to the East Coast, and all of you who are joining us here from Ann Arbor as well. So welcome to the workshop on the quotidian and the divine. I'm thrilled to actually be introducing Professor Albrecht Diem this afternoon. He will start us off with Western monasticism, and we have a day-long workshop tomorrow in 555 Weiser Hall. So please join us there as well. And our end keynote will be by Phoebe Armenios, who will take us actually to the Coptic Christian world as the conclusion to this workshop. So please do join us for what will be a feast, a monastic feast, if that exists, East and West. So I'm gonna first, yeah, please. So this was just welcoming you all, but I want to especially introduce you, Albrecht Diem, who is joining us today from Syracuse University. He teaches at the Department of History. He's a historian of late antiquity and early Middle Ages, specializing in gender and sexuality in the context of Western monasticisms, right? Diem's temporal focus is situated in this experimental phase of monasticism before the 9th century Carolingian program of standardizing gender roles and monastic rules. Cognizant of anachronisms in the field that read back medieval categories of gender and sexuality in the early history of Christianity, Diem spends time with texts produced during the monastic experiment, which is a coinage of his own, to excavate the historical processes that have turned gender and sexual activity into something in need of regulation. Diem wonders about the non-gendered in early Christian texts and practices, and the processes through which gender come to animate discourses, monastic discourses that define roles and rules for nuns and monks, distinguishing and disciplining bodily and spiritual control through ideals of virginity, chastity, and celibacy. Holding on to the premise that neither vice or virtue nor sin have a gender, Diem traces how texts are reused to tease out female voices that may have been even more generative for monastic life. Diem prompts us to rethink the importance of those so-called founding desert fathers and instead turn to the participation of women in the production of religious texts about women. Rather than see female ascetics as secondary variants of desert hermits, Diem foregrounds founding mothers like Perpetua and Melania. Drawn to revisiting his own assumptions, questioning and refining them, today Diem will reconsider his 2013 chapter on the gender of religion, woman, and the invention of monasticism, with the probably not so rhetorical question, was the first medieval monk a woman? Please join me in welcoming Albrecht Diem.
So, thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. It also feels a little bit like I could now go home because you said it all. Now I hope I can add some flesh to that, and it's just wonderful to be here. And I'm particularly looking forward to the workshop that, on the one hand, lies very much outside of me, outside of my field of expertise, but on the other hand, addresses questions that are very close to my heart, and I'm just very much looking forward to learning from you. And I hope that some of the ideas and questions I present here will resonate with your texts and with your questions. The title of my lecture was "The First Medieval Woman Reconsidered." It has a curious history, and that's not entirely a success story. A couple of years ago, I submitted an article with that title to a journal and got a reader's report with kind of this verdict: very interesting and thought-provoking, but not fully thought out yet. More work needs to be done, and ditch the title, too flashy. Revise and resubmit. Unfortunately, I never got to doing the required revisions, and instead I used some of these ideas for the chapter in the Oxford Handbook on women and gender in the Middle Ages, where I indeed had to ditch the title and turned it into a subtitle and part of a larger argument. So the original article is still on my shelf, and occasionally I chop off a bit of it, which then ends in other publications. But writing this presentation is indeed, I hope, a happy occasion to get back to it and see if I can piece it together again and add what I learned in between and produce maybe something really worth to revise and resubmit. My main argument is probably less provoking as it sounds. We have, on the one hand, a narrative, medieval and modern, that places the origins of monastic life in the Egyptian desert, in the world of the desert fathers, Antony and Pachomius, and that assumes that female monasticism appeared in the form of variants of male monastic models. Wrapped in an, again, medieval and modern narrative, almost all great monastic founding fathers had their sisters or other relatives who made a rightful claim for their own options of living a monastic life. These options were to varying degrees gender adjusted, often regarding strictness of ascetic standards or modes of enclosure and accessibility. The fact that this story is deeply rooted in medieval constructions of monastic history and identity that reach back at least into the 9th century should make us suspicious. After all, our task as historians is not to retell the stories as they were told in the past, but to explore how they came to be, to understand the formation of textual canons, and to extract from our sources the stories they did not intend to tell. Two premises that probably no one would question. First, female communal religious life is older than the Christian ascetic movements emerging at the beginning of the 4th century. Women refused to marry and lived a religious life in community under supervision of and protection of their local church leaders since biblical times, since New Testament times. We have attempts to regulate and protect female religious life that reach back much further than the first ecclesiastical councils dealing with monastic communities of monks. Second premise, there is a disconnect between the feats of radical desert ascetics who excel in superhuman practices of mortification of the body and control of the mind, and the stable and ideally perpetual monastic institutions that may have emerged around these ascetic heroes, but were much more often founded by benefactors who did not live a monastic life themselves. Monks may have claimed Antony and Pachomius as their forefathers and may have admired the reports of the desert monks, but their life was regulated rather than ascetic, and their monasteries were set up to function perpetually, not to build room for individual self-perfection. And my argument is that contrary to the self-perception and master narrative, the roots of many key aspects of monastic life can be found in much older traditions of female religious life rather than in the imagined world of the Desert Fathers. To be more concrete, when bishops started to claim control over monastic institutions and give monks a different status than lay people, and a key moment was the Council of Chalcedon in 451, they imposed on monks what they had already imposed on religious women for about 200 years. The imperative of monastic chastity and purity that enables monks to perform intercessory prayer has its roots much more in female virginity than in the lifelong battle against an invincible sexual desire that determined a radical ascetic's life. Religious women, like medieval child oblates, could enter religious life at a very young age, but we don't hear about young boys entering the desert. The oldest monastic rules, especially that of Pachomius, may have been written for both male and female communities, but the first Sancta Regula that presented itself explicitly as a salvific instrument and as a legally binding text was Caesarius Regula ad Virgines, a rule specifically written for nuns. The idea of collective sanctity, collective agency for one's own salvation, and collectively performed intercessory prayer has its roots in urban communities of praying virgins and widows. The economic model of praying communities that are endowed with estates that create enough revenues to exempt members from self-sustaining manual labor is most likely a female model, certainly not a desert father ideal. The allegedly oldest Synoretic communities had a strong emphasis on revenue-creating production. The first monastery that received a papal privilege, confirming its foundation and protecting its right and property, was the monastery for virgins founded in the early 6th century by the Bishop Caesarius of Arles, who had to make several attempts to receive papal recognition for his foundation because there was no precedent. The oldest communities of monks defined themselves as communities situated at remote spaces in the desert, or communities separated from the surrounding world by natural boundaries. The desert mattered, but the space itself, not really. Medieval monasteries became spaces with clear-cut spiritual and legal boundaries. Monastic space turned into sacred space. And if we look at protective monastic spaces, we find them in the houses of religious women. And a key figure is in giving the otherworldly space of the monastery its boundaries, a central role in the monastic pursuit was, again, Caesarius of Arles in his rule for nuns. I guess if we could do several more of these archaeological digs, of this kind. And they leave us with a long to-do list of writing a history of monasticism or of the emergence of communal religious life along these lines, rather than using the traditional turning points. I did a little bit of that, looking into the transformation of monastic chastity, into intercessory prayer, into monastic life as a vita regularis, and in particular, the history of monastic space and boundaries, but there is still a lot to do. And if you want to hear more of any of these aspects, please grill me in the Q&A. What we also could do is taking the gendering of religious life as a starting point and branching out into different directions, which add some new topics to the to-do list. First, there is at least for the Latin world, the self-evident but still awesome fact that we have monasticism as a form of life and as an option open to people regardless their gender. Not regardless their social status, but certainly regardless their gender. There were criteria of exclusion, but they did not follow the lines of gender distinction. A part of the history of monasticism is the evolution of a Latin monastic language, which is to a large extent not gendered or just divided by grammatical gender. A monasterium is a monasterium, regardless the gender of the inhabitants. A cenobium is a koinobium, a regula is a regula. We have the abbas and abbatissa, the prepositus, preposita, frater, soror. We also have a monacha and even a nonus. We have several texts that were translated from one gender to another, and nothing changed except for the grammatical gender. We take that for granted, but it's really worthwhile to think about how could that happen. And it's worth to ponder that. And it's also worth to ask whether this is a specifically Latin development, or to what extent we can encounter unisex monasticism and a non-gendered monastic language in other monastic landscapes in the Mediterranean world. And this is where I need your impact and your knowledge. And piggybacking on that, there are some differences between male and female monasticism in the West, and probably also in the East, worthwhile to look at. Religious women were, in the Latin world, monachae, sanctimoniales, virgines sacratae, famulae Dei, sorores, and there were quite a lot of more epithets. And that's the reason why I call them religious women and not just nuns. Monks were or became monachi and fathers. The language of female monasticism may have been more diverse, and this indicates that female religious life retained more, or at least other forms of diversity than male monastic life. For religious women who wanted to avoid the burden of marriage, the monastery was one option, but there were also others. Monks had at some point little other choices than joining a monastery. Monastic history is a history of diversification and unification, but these developments may not have been entirely synchronous for more male and female religious communities. So my question again to you, how is this in the eastern part of the Mediterranean world and hopefully in the Armenian world? Expanding on this idea, some of the most interesting monasteries in the West, and I know that interesting is a subjective category, are female communities, such as Cesarius of Arles Foundation in Arles, the monastery founded by Queen Radegund in Poitiers, the Burgundian monastery of Famoutier. Communities of monks may have felt a stronger need to legitimate their existence by following the established models of the Sancti Patres, albeit rhetorically. You will hardly find a text related to male monasticism that does not make a claim on a venerable monastic tradition. We find them also, these claims, in female monasticism, but since they needed anyway a sort of a gender adjustment, they may have had more leeway for experimentation and innovation. The strictly enclosed community Bishop Caesarius founded at the beginning of the 6th century in his hometown in Arles. I think I should maybe, oh no, it's still on there. In Arles was certainly an experimental community. The monastery, its sanctified rule, its holy space, and its economic model became a bottleneck through which practices of female religious life entered the male monastic world. Caesarius' Regula ad Virgines left traces in various later monastic rules written for monks, and many of the ideas, independently from the rule itself, many of his ideas got a life of their own in subsequent centuries. Half a century later, the Merovingian queen Radegund created a new kind of monastery, first a monasticized royal villa, later an enclosed urban foundation built around a splinter of the Holy Cross. Radegund's monastery was, on the one hand, meant to serve as a safe harbor for female members of a new Frankish aristocracy and the royal family, and on the other hand, follow strict ascetic standards inspired by unregulated holy men roaming around the monastery. Radegund's experiment of a relic shrine populated by highly aristocratic ladies under a strict ascetic regime became a nightmare of the local bishop, and very soon after her death exploded in a violent uprising that filled almost 2 books of Gregory of Tours' 10 books of history, the most important historiographical work of the early Middle Ages. So this one is a failed experiment, but certainly it was an experiment. Famoutier, founded another half century later, around 625, was the first attempt to create a female monastery in the tradition of the Irish monastic founder Columbanus. Jonas of Bobbio, Columbanus' hagiographer and chronicler of the Columbanian monastic movement, between fat quotation marks, devoted a larger part of the second book of his Vita Columbani to Famoutier and made it the experimental ground for shaping a monastic community that collectively overcame the pitfalls of human sinfulness through a watertight regime of mutual love, incessant confession, and a strict control of every word, sound, movement by which an individual nun might impact the monastic space and the community. So this is totally weird. This is new and different, and I think this could only happen in a female community. And later on, it had a massive impact on the further development of monastic life, regardless of gender. So these were the places where new concepts of religious life emerged. And now a last attempt to branch off from was the first medieval monk a woman idea. None of the narrators of and supposed makers of monastic history admits that there might be religious women and their communities among their ancestors. There are, though, a few instances in which we can read that's between the lines, albeit figuratively. Gregory the Great, for example, provided his hero Benedict with a sister with the programmatic name Scholastica, who allegedly had been a religious woman since her infancy. When Benedict and his sister had their spiritual deliberations that were pleasantly prolonged by a severe thunderstorm, so not like the very underwhelming thing that happened yesterday, I was warned, and I thought, we call that rain. It seems to be much more likely that he, who had already failed at least once to lead a monastic community, asked his much more experienced sister for advice than the other way around. Gregory actually leaves it in the middle, but that's not the version that made it into Christian iconography. 2 questions to be asked. How do our male narrators of monastic history deal with the existence of female monastic life and the emerging unisex monasticism? Some of our loudest voices, the 5th century monastic theologian John Cassian, the author of the Regula Benedicti, or the Irish monastic founder Columbanus, belonged to a majority that simply ignored the female monastic option. At least John Cassian, at least John Cassian tied the ascetic pursuit of perfection to masculinity. His Collationes, the 24 interviews with desert fathers that created the desert in the mind of every medieval monk, pretend that women ascetics don't exist. A good monk has to flee women just as much as he has to flee bishops who might ordain him. In his Institutiones, he manages to shape a highly sophistical cartography of the desolate landscape of the human mind and the forces that destroy our focus, but the human mind is definitively that of a man. The 8 destructive thoughts that later turned into the 7 deadly sins were men's thoughts and not women's. Benedict's rule is a program of soothing God's anger by means of humility, unconditional obedience, and giving up one's own will. But at no point Benedict considers, or the author of the Rule of Benedict, considers it applicable to both genders. Dito Columbanus, whose letters, sermons, rules, and penitentials imply that the only women that exist are those a monk could illicitly desire and engage in acts of fornication. It's remarkable, though, what happens to these makers of monastic history afterwards. Tradition gives Cassian a sister and makes him founder of a female community in Marseille. Gregory the Great gave his Benedict as a learned sister, Scholastica. And the 2 oldest witnesses of the Regula Benedicti are 2 rules for nuns. The Regula Donati, which excerpts him, and the Regula Cuiusdam ad Virgines, which thoroughly rewrites the text. Jonas of Bobbio writes a Vita of Columbanus that emphasizes that Columbanus' main interlocutors and sponsors were aristocratic ladies, and he was also the one who replaced the Regula Columbani by the Regula Cuiusdam ad Virgines, the thorough female revision of the Regula Benedicti that I just mentioned. So the narrators and creators of the male-only monasticism did not get away with it, and it would be worthwhile to investigate if there is a pattern of repair. And I would also be very curious what you have to contribute to that. A last spin-off of what's the first medieval monk and woman idea. I had already mentioned that it was not difficult to translate monastic texts to another gender. Contrary to what we might expect, it may have happened more often female to male than male to female, and the other way around. One of the most widespread monastic sermons of Caesarius of Arles appears to be a close rewrite of Caesarius' Epistola Verio, a call for virginity and lifelong monastic fight, addressing the community of nuns headed by his sister. Aurelianus of Arles, Caesarius' successor, wrote a monastic rule in a male and a female version, and there is no definitive proof that the male version was the older one, even though it's kind of always automatically assumed. The great monastic reformer Benedict of Agnane in the Carolingian period produced at the beginning of the 9th century a collection of male and female monastic rules, the Codex Regularum, and then processed his material in a commentary to the Rule of Benedict. On the way, he changed the grammatical gender of all his material from rules for nuns to the male gender. So in these cases, texts initially written for nuns could easily be applied to monks. But I mean, the last example, we see that the nuns are basically or the fact that these were rules for women was basically deleted, and the further line of reception is simply not visible and known anymore. At this point, I would like to leave my safe territory of the Latin monastic world and phrase some very preliminary observations on some narrators of monastic history in the Greek world. And this is here I'm starting. I'm really a complete beginner. The most important narrative sources that determine our perception of the Eastern Mediterranean, of the early Eastern Mediterranean monasticism, are 4 collective hagiographical works, or maybe better travel logs, because they shaped through real and imagined journeys, regionally confined ascetic landscapes. These landscapes were created by individuals who were no saints in any Western Latin understanding, though they were certainly holy men, or rather holy individuals of the sort masterfully described by Peter Brown. Some of them were still alive when their story was told. Most others had died within a living memory. The sequences of post-mortem miracles that we tend to find in Western hagiography are not part of these stories. So these were living saints, and what they did when they were alive. Our four texts are the anonymous Historia Monachorum from the beginning of the 5th century, which was translated into Latin soon after its production, and this also strongly contributed to shaping the imagined desert routes of Western monasticism. Then the Historia Lausiaca, written a few years later, probably around 420 by Bishop Palladius, also widespread in the Latin world. Then the Historia Religiosa or Historia Philotea of Bishop Theodoret of Cyrus in the northern part of Syria, written maybe a decade later. And then 150 years later, the Spiritual Meadow, written by the Byzantine monk John Moschus. A big item on my to-do list is analyzing these texts as Gesamtkunstwerke that each represent their own monastic ideal, their own theological framework, monastic idiom, and narrative strategies. So tearing them apart rather than lumping them together or using them as quarry for factual information. And they are certainly worth to do this. We can look at them from three angles. First, as distorted they may have been, they somehow reflected a reality. They were written for an audience of potential witnesses. So on that level, we need to take them seriously. Second, there were programs and products of an agenda, which we have to understand before we make them a source on facts. Thirdly, they shaped the deserts in the minds both of their medieval readers and of modern historians, created identities, and created the monastic language we use. The Historia Monachorum and the Historia Lausiaca became part of a Desert Father canon that remained in its core unchanged since the Carolingian period, and then crossed over into the printed world and ended up eventually in volume 73 and volume 74 of the Patrologia Latina. And they're still the backbone of any modern narrative of late antique monasticism. We still, for some of these texts, we still use the PL reprint, which is the product of a mind of counter-reformatorial scholars. So this is really worthwhile to keep in mind. So it's worthwhile to figure out how these texts work and to question, and the question about gender is one of the first ones to ask to unlock them. So for the first one, the Historia Monachorum, the answer is simple. It's an author who creates a monastic world that's about as male as that of John Cassian. There's no place for women in the desert. Female religious life may have existed, but it's not part of the story. There are two stories of robbers who tried to rob from religious women and later convert, and there's one story about a woman healed by holy men, and that's it in the entire Historia Monachorum. So he certainly had not the idea, not at all an idea in mind that this is that religious life, monastic life is in any way unisex. The Historia Lausiaca, written soon afterwards by someone moving in the same circles as the author of the Historia Monachorum, begins with the following sentence. In this book is recorded the wonderful, fully virtuous and ascetic life of holy fathers, monks, and anchorites of the desert. It is written for the emulation and imitation of those who wish to succeed in the heavenly way of life and to take the journey which leads to the kingdom of heaven. It is written also to commemorate women for far advanced in age and illustrious God-inspired mothers who have performed feats of virtues, asceticism in strong and perfect intention as exemplars and models for those women who wish to wear the crown of self-abnegation and chastity. Later on, Palladius states, I leave you an account now, an epitome, as it were, of merely the outstanding ascetic practices and miracles of the noble athletes and great men, and not only of men, famous for their strict way of life, but of holy high-born women too, who lived the best and loftiest life. And later on, it is all in this book, the contest of great men and of the women too, more like men in their nature than in name, than the name implies, thanks to their hope in Christ. Palladius makes this point twice more in the prologue. He wants to convey two ideas. First, there is a whole spectrum of ascetic practice ranging from radical neglect of the body, spending one's life in the monastery, to disinheriting one's children and giving one's wealth to the poor. And many of these options can easily be emulated. Perfect life exists, as he emphasizes later, not only in the desert, but also in villages and cities. Second, all these options are not gendered. And it's important to notice that he applies the expression ascesis equally to men and to women. So women don't get sort of the easier way, but they can. If we look at the text, the work as a whole, we see that Palladius still writes more about holy men than about holy women, but women play a role in all capacities, as desert hermits, as members, leaders, and founders of monasteries, as highly learned individuals, teachers of both women and men, but also as sponsors of monastic life who exercise control over their wealth, as travelers and visitors of holy people, and as Palladius informers. There's nothing women can't do because they're women, except for being ordained as priests. His friend Melania the Elder, who shows up several times in his works, embodies most of these qualities. And time and again, Palladius emphasizes that the power dynamics between men and women are equal. Religious women act and decide autonomously and collaboratively with their male partners. They do not just carry out what men told them. And in one of the most remarkable passages, Palladius attacks the church father Jerome for his insufferable behavior towards women and his abuse of the intellectual capacities of the learned women who assist him. Palladius also ignores the trope of women as dangerous to male chastity. In his Historia Lausiaca contains several descriptions of men endangered by or succumbing to their sexual desires. But for him, it's their problem and not the women's fault that they suffer. I assume that Palladius, probably inspired by Melania and his other female friends, deliberately writes against a viewpoint expressed in the Historia Monachorum, but also in other Desert Father reports that give women a place in the margin and makes male desert asceticism the benchmark of perfection. He may have done so out of his conviction, but his refutation of the male-only monastic narrative may also have been motivated by the awareness that someone has to pay the bill. Because living a life of self-imposed individual and collective poverty does never come for free. If we can believe Palladius, more often than not, rich Roman aristocratic ladies, Melania the Older and Melania the Younger in particular, were those who opened their purse. So setting things right and telling a story that comes probably much closer to the ascetic reality of Egypt and its surrounding was the central part of his agenda. And if we compare him with the other travel logs, we can actually see how exceptional this was. Theodore of Cyrus wrote his Historia Religiosa, or as the text calls it in the Greek original Historia Philotea, roughly at the same time as Palladius. He had an entirely different agenda, even though he may have shared some of Palladius' ideas about gender. With his work, he firmly returns into a desert, though certainly as Peter Brown has observed, a very different kind of desert as Egypt. The holy man he describes in the first 28 chapters of his work are definitely no role models to be emulated, and no ordinary Christian in search of options of good life could take them as a model. They combine the most radical forms of bodily asceticism, immurement, insufferable fasting, exposure to nature, chains around one's body, standing on a pillar and feeding the maggots on one's wounds that would become precious souvenirs. They did that while teaching and entertaining the masses. And it has a lot to do with entertainment. Theodore, Bishop of Syracuse, had its own set of problems. On the one hand, he was deeply involved in the Christological debates of his time, and the fact that he temporarily chose the wrong side, that of the supporters of Nestorius, may have been one of the reasons why his work never made it into the Latin world. The Stylites and cave saints in his diocese could, on the one hand, have served as allies in his theological struggles, or at least as witnesses that he's on the right side. On the other hand, they had, due to their immense popularity, also a large disruptive potential and could compete with his own position as bishop. So his Historia Philotea had the purpose of putting a discursive monopoly on these holy pop stars to control their memoria, and not in the last place to write himself into their history as a witness, as an interlocutor, friend, and moderator. Another challenge Theodore may have faced was that he lived in a world that was intellectually, but also socially still pagan, regardless how Christian the population may have been. One of his main works, after all, was a treatise on the remedies of the Greek maladies, the last refutation of ancient paganism. And Syracuse had actually the greatest amphitheater in Syria. Theodore's Historia Religiosa faced all three challenges in a masterful way. The first one by simply ignoring all theological battles and giving the impression of doctrinal unity. The second by making all these holy weirdos, and they were really weird, parts of his religious landscape. And the third one, and this is the most fascinating, by shaping his own probably unique form of Christian masculinity. A masculine world in which women primarily play one role, that of awed and excited spectators who cheered, but without forming any danger. Theodore's holy men play, as he emphasizes in his prologue, two roles. They were athletes, the true Christian alternative to Olympic champions and charioteers, who rightfully deserve to be memorized and idealized, just as sports champions were wrongfully idealized. They are the true men set apart from effeminate and gender ambiguous acting stars. Their gymnasium, palestra, or sports arena is the desert. God is the great umpire in their ascetic contest. That's one way of framing them. Athletes of Christ, and by the way, they were never called cold martyrs. So this is a totally different discourse. Secondly, there are philosophers, and what they practice is true philosophy. And maybe as part of it, and that's the most interesting thing for me, they are lovers. Theodore describes the relationship between the ascetic and God consistently in terms of Platonic paideresteia. The ascetic is the Erastes, the lover, the pursuer. God is the Eronymos, taking the role of the desirable adolescent. The bizarrely strict asceticism Theodore's monks perform is on the one hand sports, and on the other hand, a form of making love with God. And by all modern standards, we would call that quite kinky. Women do not form a threat in this love relationship. If at all, it's the voluptuous boy who, according to his own saying, already destroyed many ascetic pursuits, or the desirable side of a bunch of farm workers that interrupted a saint's reflections on the Holy Scriptures so that he punished himself by chaining his neck to his knees in a way that prevented him from ever casting his eye on anyone desirable for the rest of his life. So there's the danger, not the women. Theodore's desert gymnasium is built for true men, true athletes, and an army of God lovers. Women were not on Theodorus' agenda, aside from those who flock around the saints in awe, who are curiously headed by his own mother. So it might be not at least for this audience that he wrote his Historia Religiosa. At the end of his work, however, he reveals that his focus on male athletes and lovers of God was not motivated by any theological disregard of women's ascetic pursuit. He adds 2 lives of female radical ascetics, adds that there were many others scattered all over the Christian world, and explicitly refers to Galatians 3:28. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free man, nor is there male and female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus. But still, women appear in the appendix, just as they appear still in the appendix of some modern survey studies of monastic history. But it's not because it just was not on the specific agenda he had with this text. Things look very differently in the last ascetic travel log, John Mosco's Spiritual Meadow, which was written in the early 7th century, very shortly before the Eastern Mediterranean came under Arab rule. Mosco's collected stories and saying of monks from the entire Mediterranean world, from Egypt to Syria and Cyprus, and his world is about as exclusively male as that of the Historia Monachorum. So now, with a strongly misogynist undertone, women are either prostitutes and seducers or helpless individuals in need of support and guidance of holy fathers, or passive partners of their husbands who make decisions on both of their names. Any woman taking an active role does so with evil intentions or disastrous effects. Incidentally, we hear about female religious communities, but they are clearly not part of the world John Moscus wants to shape and to be remembered through his narrative. Here again, we could ask whether we deal with an individual misogynist narrator or whether he represents a post-Justinian militarized, moralized, and anxiety-driven society on the edge that works on modes of exclusion and discrimination. And this is just an idea, and I need your help and your guidance if I'm right with that. Aside from vilifying women who do not play their assigned role, Moscus is also obsessed with religious dissenters of all possible sorts. The world of true monks has become narrow and endangered. So what I hope to show through this description is to what extent our knowledge and memory of female religious life is determined by the individual agendas of the authors who produced our sources. In most cases, these narrative agendas led to a distorted view of a religious landscape in which religious women played an essential and yet untold role. And of course, these texts did have an impact by denying future female religious communities their roots, their models, and opportunities for identification. Even Palladius, however, who is the most sympathetic to female religious life, and explicitly does not deny that women may be able to make the same make the same achievements as men, does never acknowledge that female religious communities may be older than those of men and may have served as their models. His point of reference remains Antony, the first desert father, who is invoked several times as a shared ancestor of ascetic traditions. The much older community that welcomed Antony's unnamed sister is not part of his history. So it remains our task to read our sources against the grain, to replace the still powerful narrative of the Desert Fathers as founding figures of monastic life by a story that is still largely untold. Thank you.
Do you take your own questions?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the informative and educational lecture. It's very fascinating. whets my appetite to want to read more about the thoughts of the ladies, for example. Thank you. I make it a point every year to get away from my cell phone and TV and telephone, and even my friends and family. And I travel around the world choosing a specific monastery. And I finally hit upon a monastery that was run by all females. And I liked it so much because there was obviously a different flavor to it. And every monastery you can go to, for those of you who go to monasteries, know that like snowflakes, they're alike because of the influence of people like Saint Benedict and Scholastica and Gregory. But like all snowflakes under a microscope, they're all different. And some of them are 5-star places. And I'm not just talking about the food. But the last 3 monasteries I've gone to, and it's not by accident, have all been female abbeys or monasteries, including the one in Sacré-Cœur in Paris, France, Montmartre area where Van Gogh lived. It's run by these nuns there, strict but fair, but it's a first-class operation. And they consider themselves, quote unquote, brides of Christ or whatever. But there's no male influence. Everyone there, they're very personable, quiet. They'll leave you alone so you can meditate and enjoy the tranquility, but always there to engage you and educate you. So, and there's a couple here in the United States I could recommend too. It's just that I understand that by going now to female-run monasteries and abbeys here in the United States and across the world, that there's something that you can't quite put your finger on, but they're different. And they're different in a, not necessarily more spiritual, but they're different in a better way. And so thank you very much for your lecture. And I'm going to have to look into the Greek side of all this.
Of course, it'd be much better to hear actually the voice of colleagues who are coming from female monastic communities. But what I got from them is one of the things that makes them different is a sort of structural anger and a sort of a slight spirit of resistance. And also, and this is something I really think I would like to sort out and probably are working on that is to what extent do we have alternative genealogies and alternative narratives, and to what extent, and it does exist in a marginal way, but it does exist that we find explicit genealogies in which Tekla and Perpetua and Melania are figuring large. But this is still, at least for the West, not yet properly sorted out. These kind of attempts to create one's own history. Yeah. So there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for your lecture and for circulating your paper. I just had a question coming from someone who does Armenian studies. The concept that you had, and I can't say that this is my primary focus, but the concept of the sister that you brought up, that a lot of these figures had a sister that is rarely studied. Do you know of any parallels in Armenian monastic history? Because I could only think of more, I'm not sure if you know of any, but I could think of female martyrs, but I couldn't think of any in, again, the very beginning stages of my research of a sister figure.
The turtle sister is fairly important in other contexts.
But is that considered?
Yeah, I don't think it's a sister in the same way. But she's
That's
the only early sister that I can.
Okay, that's what I was wondering, if there was like another.
I have a small request. I think we're recorded on Zoom. So the more you shout, the more the people out there in the box will enjoy our conversation. So the question was about sisters and this brother-sister motive
that's very prevalent in Latin monastic history, that's present also in the Greek world, but exists in the Armenian world. And you gave an example, so maybe can you shout it?
Hold on, I'll give you the Lauren.
Not the people in the
I would just say in the Agathangelos narrative of the history of the conversion of Armenia to Christianity, so Turdot the king is only like saved basically because his sister has the idea to like get Gregory out of the pit. And then Gregory is able to like go and convert everybody, but it's his sister. And there is a lot of stuff in Zoroastrianism, which I'm not a Zoroastrian scholar, but brother sister stuff is very important in Zoroastrianism. Like I think there's a lot of brother sister marriage between the kings, but also just like brother sister duality. Not my area, but there's definitely like
Something there.
Yeah.
Do you know of anything with in Armenia in monasticism? Anything come to mind?
We have some specialists back there.
Oh, I'm just so very interested. It was very interesting to figure out if there was anything.
Yeah, thank you so much. So unfortunately, I can't think of any examples of like these like holy women as sisters in a monastic setting for Armenian, but the famous, probably the most famous sister from the late antique world is Macrina. Right. It was just really interesting, right? So she's the sister of Gregory of Nyssa and these other and Basil and of Caesarea, and she comes from a prominent family. And when her fiance dies, right, she basically goes to their family's kind of like estate out in the countryside and forms like a communion of women who worship God together. So it's very much considered like the first like women's monastery. And so it's interesting because when I saw the title of your talk, it is provocative, but the answer is somewhat yes, right? I mean, for the East, right, is depending on where you consider the kind of like the medieval world beginning. But it's also interesting to think about, and I really appreciate kind of your discussion of these four texts. And I wonder what type of history we can get if we just ignore them, right? Because they aren't, as you say, right, they are kind of writing their own history and kind of reshaping the world from their own lens. And so I'm thinking of other examples of like women monasteries, like Shenouda of Atripes, the White Monastery, and Egeria, right, who visits Edessa in the Near East, and presumably comes from some type of monastic community in like Aquitaine area or something. And so thinking about, I just really appreciate and want to thank you again for how important these texts are to our history, but perhaps how, I don't want to say useless, but how like inaccurate they are, and that's why they're interesting. So thank you.
Yes, I mean, we ignoring them probably doesn't help them against the grain. That brought up Macrina, and Macrina is of course a wonderful example because Macrina is certainly Basil is the little brother, and he's a sort of a full of himself brat who just comes out of law school, and she brings him in and she tells him how he his life. So at least according to the Vita of Macrina, it's very clear who's in the driver's. And we just tend to look at these as wonderful exceptions, and we tend to look at Scholastica and the way how sort of the iconography works. But actually, if you read the story, and I sort of just to check it, I reread the passage of Gregory. It's very clear. It's totally in the middle who teaches whom. He does not make a clear point on that. And the interesting thing about the system motive is many of them probably did have a sister, but some of them actually, like Cassian, got it through tradition. Honoratus of Lerins got a sister later on. Benedict, whoever that was, I'm pretty sure that Gregory decided to give him a sister with that very problematic name, as part of creating a fitting narrative. So it's interesting that and this is just this hypothesis that a narrative that ignores the unisex aspect, that can't stand, that needs to be rectified in this way. And I just wonder if, and the Historia Lausiaca is for me an example of that. I think it's really a response to the Historia Monaco, just saying, okay, this is not how it works. This is not how we can depict it. And I just wonder if we find more examples of this tendency of making clear there is a cautiously said unisex aspect, which of course has to do with the fact that you get into trouble with women in power who want to emphasize that that there are options, equally valuable options for religious life. I mean, there are the two Melanias, there are the friends of Jerome, who probably really suffered from him. And so you can't get around their claims that we have a place in it. Yeah.
I thought of another sister. Again, this is, I know you have about, but this is still iffy, but sitting here thinking of siblings.
In the Persian martyr acts, I want to say in the history of Marmain, but I really am not sure which. There's a pair or a triplet of 3 siblings, 2 boys and a girl, and the girl is the one who becomes the famous saint of the 3 of them. I think her name is like Mahraduk or something like that. This is more.
Persian.
I think it's
Okay.
But it's in the milieu, and I think she also is worth. Her name's like Mahraduk or something. I wish I remembered so you could actually Google it. But she's also like, important.
Thank you. Yeah. Kind of Google it. Yes.
Just monastery.
Thank you so much for a really enlightening talk. I want to zoom back on a very, very specific micro point in your reading of Palladius and how you tied it, interpretively, the generosity that he gives to women, if I can use that term, is very much tied in a reciprocal exchange of, money. Women's earning power, women as economic actors in that situation lend itself to a more generous reading. And I'm wondering if there's an entire history of that project to be written, a parallel with looking at Christian religious texts about women, paralleling thinking about women's changing status and their earning power. Maybe not so much for this period, because I know the data would be limited. But I'm just thinking later for other studies, whether one can really use that, hone in on that, and think whether it's a variable among many other variables. Is this just a special case of Palladius having a personal relationship with his patrons that was very, respectful and so on? I just found that point intriguing and would love to hear your comment on it.
Oh, absolutely. With all the conflicts involved and sort of we have especially for the sort of the first half of the Merovingian period, we have a sequence of very, very powerful queens, Brunhild, Fredegund, later on Balthild, and they're all monastic sponsors. And one of the most prolific one is the heavily vilified Brunhildis, who most likely founded and endowed the monastery of Luxeuil, headed by Columbanus, and they got into trouble because Columbanus started mixing him, mixing him into Merovingian family politics, and that did not go down well. So he eventually was kicked out by Brunhildis and her grandson, probably for good reasons, because they paid the bill. And what he did was not what he was paid for. So this kind of female patronage and also female involvement if we start looking for it, and indeed you're totally right, completely right. We need to train our eyes on that, but we'll probably find many, many more examples. Also, certainly a lot of Carolingian examples.
I'm curious in the East too.
Yeah.
And how, because it would be a little harder to grasp out, but there could be like some interesting possibilities. Yeah. Okay, we have Jimmy back here.
Sorry to be jumping out all the time. This is just really exciting. So there's a scholar at Penn, her name's Kim Bowes, and she works right on kind of like the private sphere and its role in like the early monastic movement in North Africa and other places. And she works and shows that a lot of these kind of major senatorial class villas in North Africa were probably run by women. And a lot of them also have these kind of like private shrines, or from other archaeological remains, they can tell that they were serving some type of like communal worship. So her work is really, really fascinating. And I'd be happy to share that with everyone. And also about thinking about women from like the East. So Simeon the Stylite, who is one of these kind of weirdos, and one of these holy men. He's interesting, right? Because the land, right? So his compound, which was this massive compound with his pillar and all these different hotels and taverns, and there's graffiti saying like, I had a good drink here, right? And so that was all donated by his wealthy aunt. And so again, this is demonstrating, right, the fact that at this time in Roman law, women were able to inherit on their own. They were able to accrue wealth through many means. And so it's really interesting to see kind of these different ways.
Maybe we can cautiously screw the screw a little bit further, and I wonder if there was a stronger pressure on women who had control over their property to give it to the church or found monasteries or however invested in religious causes than there was on men. Hypothesis, question, possible. It is possible that gender difference comes in that through that backdoor again, but this is just an idea. So, yeah.
I also, just going back to the economic part of your question, I think it's so interesting that like something that's so deeply associated with like nunneries and like women in monastic spaces is like weaving and actively, like you said, like creating textiles and garments, which were always meant to be, even if not like sold, like were useful items that like in the same way that like a man wearing a hair sheet in the desert or a hair shirt in the desert, like you're not producing anything, like you are producing your own spiritual whatever, but you're not like producing a physical item that like helps pay for the land that you're on in the same way. And so I do wonder if there's pressure on like nunneries or female monasteries from the beginning to sort of like justify the ability to own that land by creating material objects, like, by doing labor, in a way that I think men, or at this time period in Egypt, like get to do spiritual labor, which sort of doesn't have like a tangible, do you know what I mean?
It would be sort of an interesting reversal, and we need to test it from how we, or at least how I would expect the story to be. I mean, what we see, for example, if we read the Rule of Pachomius, which does exist or did exist in a male and a female version, and so we have only fragments of a female version. There's a strong emphasis on production. And there's the reality, but certainly the motive of rope waving and basket waving as a sort of and there as a monastic activity. But admittedly, I have not looked systematically into female modes of production. I mean, there's of course there are references to book production, especially in the context of Caesarius's monastery. There is the waving, but there is also a lot of emphasis on prayer and withdrawal. And certainly if we look at Caesarius' foundation in Arles, his main concern was giving his monastery, his foundation, an economic structure that allows the nuns to stay inside and to keep a total irreversible enclosure. And there are no, in that text, no sign. Well, actually, there's an explicit prohibition against storing and repairing clothing, which means that other female communities actually did it. But in this case, Cesarius said, no, you're not producing for the outside world. But that you're completely right. That means that this was an issue.
That's interesting.
Thank you so much. This is such an interesting talk, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with you further at some point. But I'm a little estranged from the world of like the early medieval, but I was wondering when you talk about the kind of creation of a unisex model of monasticism, one thing that came up for me was the question of double monasteries and how that sort of fits into this picture. I don't know if you've thought about that yet, but as you've been exploring this, but how that might fit in. And then I have a sort of affiliated question. Earlier, you sort of invited us to ask you about some of the other origins of monastic life in feminine communities in particular. And I'm particularly interested in space and wondered if you might talk a little bit more about the creation of monastic space. And if you could relate that to double monasteries, that would be even more fabulous.
Yes, I can do that. And we need to make sure that you at the dinner have space. Space in communicable distance, because I really want to hear more about your ideas about that. Yes, the problem with double monasteries is this is a sort of a modern umbrella term that is applied to various forms of female communities related to male communities. There are probably rather few double monasteries in the sense of communities of mixed gender. There were experiments rather in the high Middle Ages of that, but there were a lot of monasteries that functioned, or let's put it that way, there were a lot of female communities that included monks. And there's always the question with, especially these monasteries founded in the 7th century, allegedly inspired by Columbanus, that sometimes appear as female communities and sometimes as double monasteries, Remiremont, for example. And most likely they were female communities headed by an abbess. But a monastic community always included more than just nuns or monks. So there were always people around, probably more people. It's just like that we have more cells in our body that have not our DNA than we have cells that are actually our own, or we own all of them. But anyway, so any monastic community has servants, has slaves, has people living on the estates. And there were probably quite a lot of female monasteries that also involved monks in their surrounding. And there were places of overlap in which both monks and nuns operated. So in that sense, and this is, you can tie that to space, and you can tie that to notions of a one-gendered enclosure, and probably as a sort of an emerging model, sort of an intermediate space between the outer world, the outside world, and the enclosure, in which monks and nuns may have mixed and mingled in order to keep the shop running. And of course, if you have a shop that operates on a stricter level of enclosure, and that's the case probably for most female communities, the more you need men who operate outside and indeed make sure that the community survives. And so I guess this is one and probably the most prevalent model of a double monastery, a female monastery that employed monks. But this is also something on the long shopping list of reassessing early medieval monasticism.
You have a question right there, but didn't you have a second part to your question?
Yeah, it was more about space.
Don't start me on space unless you have a lot of time.
It's probably not a question, but it's a comment. What I find so attractive about your model is the fact that, sort of this masculinization of the monastic tradition is not self-evident. It is itself the product of making, of silencing consciously, of ignoring, and of providing other models, it's an active process. And so we've, in our discussion, I think, focused most on, this other tradition, how women, might have taken example from these models or, sort of have had a sense of their own tradition, but it's also the other tradition needs to be explained as well. And it's a dialectical or, it's a process, sort of, that it's just not self-evident, because at first when I heard you speak on this particular occasion, I've heard you frequently, and I thought, it's like this process is a little bit like modernization, it happens and it's automatic, but no, it's a complex and wonderfully textured, process. And I find that very attractive and appealing.
Yeah, whenever we read these texts, of course, I mean, this is bread and butter. We need to read them with an eye on their agenda and with an eye on their agency.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. Maybe along similar lines, I was curious if you could talk more about how religious feats are gendered in your sources. And I was thinking especially of Theodoret and what happens when the two women appear in the appendix and they do religious feats as well. Does he have to, masculinize them in some way, or does he have to break his schema or forget about it and do something else?
Well, I think he does both. He brings in, on the one hand, he brings in the idea of Galatians 3:28, and on the other hand, there is this motive of it's male only, but you can always change your gender. So this is, I think if I remember well, both elements are in there, and both elements are just as much in the Historia Lausiaca. And this is of course something we find in many other texts. We find it as part of the narrative that you indeed change your gender, but also as part of the assessment that this terrible motive, the widespread motive of she overcame the weakness of her gender and then performed all these great things. So you have it sort of in different gradations of making it real, but it's not only that. So there are both elements. There is especially in Palladius, there is this emphasis. They can do both the same, and there is also the idea they became manly by. But the what we just should avoid, seeing that both exist, is sort of introduce or saying, well, this was how it worked. Women were recognized when they made themselves masculine. it's there, but it's not the only thing that was there. And this is, I think, quite important to keep in mind. What is, I made a sort of a side remark, which also in that chapter, which is also worthwhile to explore further, is that learnedness is, as far as I know, never really tied to gender. So, the motive of she was very learned, despite the fact that she was a woman. I have never seen that, but I see a lot of it's in if I read my set of female saints' lives from the early Middle Ages, the motive of the saint as teacher and the emphasis on learnedness is a very persistent element of female hagiography. But I've never seen, and maybe you've seen it, but I have not seen it, the motive of intellect despite of gender.
Islamic world. But I wanted to follow up on what Michael is asking, because I was also confused or wanted to know more about, we talked about a grammatical shift, right? I mean, from female to male, right? And to stop a little bit in this process of thinking about, so what does that grammatical shift entail, right? It's beyond just the she to he, right? There's this whole process that also goes. It's not the exact acts that these women were experimenting on that gets translated, or is it? I just wanted to hear a little bit more stuff, grammatical translation or shift.
You've got both, and I only as all the time, unfortunately, I only can talk about my Latin material, and I'm curious about the other material. But we have got both in writing texts. We have, for example, what Benedicto Famiane did, which just simply erased all the female, all the references to female grammatical gender and made it invisible. But it's still exactly the same texts. And he did not change any of the content. And he did not have to change any of the content. That's important to keep in mind. We have a couple of examples from that, from the earlier period. We have also talking about this ever fascinating, incredible rule for nuns of Caesarius of Arles. We have a sort of a mixture of that when we look at his successor Aurelianus, who wrote this rule that's almost the same for men and for women. And for this one rule, he also used a lot of material from Caesarius. Partly he rephrased it and he wrote it and rewrote it and changed it, and partly he quoted verbatim, but the revisions that I saw have actually very little to do with gender, but with a different theological framing and with a different function of the monastery in society. And that also applies to the differences between Aurelianus's rule for monks and rule for nuns. Of course, he, throughout the chapters on priests, because that doesn't apply, he interestingly enough also throughout, and then we need to start to think. He also threw out the chapters on the dangers of same-sex sexuality that are, or actually no, he did not throw out. We don't know, either he threw them out indeed, or he added them when he wrote the version for monks. So there are clearly gendered aspects, and there is clearly a revision that takes gender into account. But there are also revisions that have totally different motivations, and there are also a lot of not revisions at all. And something that it's also on my to-do list. There's so much on the to-do list, but there are female versions of the Rule of Benedict, which are, as far as I know, which is really outrageous, not edited. So for them, we need to go to, at least for the early medieval ones, we need to look at the manuscripts themselves and actually really sort of comb through them, how they have been adjusted. So that work also still needs to be done.
Okay. Question, I'll come to you.
Oh, I've asked a bunch. Does anyone else?
Does anyone have another question other than Lauren?
I mean, I'm happy to keep talking. This is from the Song of Songs. So, like, my sister is a gardening clothes, and I was wondering if there's any references to that passage in sort of these early texts talking about like creating enclosures for sacred space.
Not that I know, but I have not looked for it. But there is if you talk about the Song of Songs, the interesting thing is about of Theodore of Cyrus's religious history with the making kinky love with God. That text starts out with contrasting this super masculine God lovers with gender ambiguous actors and with racing stars, and the end of that work is a commentary on the Song of Songs.
Okay, well, you've really laid such a wonderful foundation for tomorrow with dinner conversation. Thank you so much.